Audrey Collins was 26 years old when her father threw her away. She lost her home in a single night. But what she didn't know was this. Somewhere beyond the rain and the darkness, in a forgotten ghost town called Black Hollow, stood the Black Rose Hotel, and somehow it had been waiting for her for over 100 years, except for one room, room 13. No one had entered it for a century. Until the night Audrey arrived, inside was a secret so devastating. It destroyed the Collins family long ago, and somehow it was about to save the last person carrying that name. Stay with me, because if you've ever wished someone had loved you differently, this story was written for you. Audrey Collins was 26 years old when she disappeared. For almost 3 weeks, nobody knew where she was. Then she came back, with a rusted silver key, a century-old diary, and a story so heartbreaking that it changed an entire town. But to understand what happened, you have to start with the night her father told her to leave. Most people spend their lives searching for a place where they belong. Audrey spent hers believing she never would. She didn't know it yet. But somewhere beyond the snow and the silence, an old hotel had been waiting for her for more than 100 years, and somehow it would become the first place that ever loved her back. The night she left home was painfully quiet. No shouting, no slammed doors, just the sound of rain tapping softly against the kitchen window. Her father sat at the table staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her stepmother stood by the sink. Neither of them looked at her. Finally, her father spoke. "You need to go, Audrey." His voice wasn't angry. That would have been easier. It was tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying grief for too long. Audrey looked at him, waiting for him to smile. Tell her he didn't mean it. He never did. Because Audrey had always known there was something broken between them. Her mother died giving birth to her. The baby boy she'd carried didn't survive either. Her father never blamed Audrey directly, not in words, but grief has its own language. Forgotten birthdays, empty hugs, and the way someone looks at you when they're trying not to remember what they lost. When Audrey was 13, she overheard him whisper to an old friend, "Everything good in my life ended the day she was born." He never knew she heard him, but children don't forget words like that. They build entire lives around them. Then her father remarried. Her stepmother wasn't cruel. Not exactly. She was simply the kind of woman who made Audrey feel like a guest in her own family. An empty seat at dinner, a birthday card never signed, a silence that lingered just a little too long. Year after year, Audrey convinced herself things would get better. They never did. By 26, she worked at a flower shop in Milwaukee. She loved flowers because they bloomed anyway. Even after harsh winters, even after being cut, there was something brave about that. That winter, her stepmother announced they were moving to Arizona. A fresh start, just not for Audrey. Her father sat quietly beside her, avoiding her eyes, then finally whispered, "I'm sorry," and somehow those two words hurt more than hatred, because apologies don't give back lonely childhoods. They don't erase empty spaces, and they certainly don't teach you how to love yourself. An hour later, Audrey packed a suitcase, a blanket, and an old photograph of her mother. That was all she owned. She climbed into her faded blue Chevrolet and drove into the storm. The farther she drove, the harder it rained. The radio died. Then her GPS. Then the engine. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Audrey stepped outside. Rain poured from a sky black as ink. And through the fog, she saw a rusted sign. "Welcome to Black Hollow," a town she'd never heard of. Then she looked up. At the top of the hill stood an enormous hotel, its gardens wild, its walls swallowed by ivy, its windows dark. Except for one, a single golden light burned steadily on the third floor, warm, basient, as if someone had been waiting for her. For a very, very long time. The closer Audrey Collins got to the hotel, the more she felt something strange stirring inside her. Not fear, not exactly. It felt more like recognition, like she was walking toward a place she'd dreamed about her whole life, but somehow forgotten. The old hotel stood at the top of the hill, silent against the storm. Its stone walls were wrapped in ivy. The iron gates hung crooked on rusted hinges. Rainwater streamed down cracked statues of angels that lined the entrance, their faces worn smooth by time. Above the front door, barely visible beneath layers of moss, were 4 faded words. The Black Rose Hotel. Lightning flashed. For a heartbeat, the building seemed alive. Its towers rose into the darkness. Its balconies cast long shadows, and on the 3rd floor, that single golden window still glowed. Steady, warm, waiting. Audrey pulled her coat tighter. Every instinct told her to turn around, but the truth was, she had nowhere else to go, and somehow, that old hotel looked less lonely than she felt. She climbed the stone steps slowly. The front door stood slightly open, just enough, as if someone had left it that way on purpose. "Hello," she called. Nothing. Only the sound of rain and the distant groan of old wood. Audrey pushed the door. It opened with a long, aching creak. The lobby beyond took her breath away. Even buried beneath dust and silence, it was beautiful. A grand staircase curved upward beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. Its candles had long gone out, but somehow it still felt elegant. Portraits hung on the walls. Men in dark suits, women wearing pearls and lace, all staring down at her. Watching, Audrey swallowed. The air smelled of cedar, old books, and roses. That surprised her. How could a place abandoned for decades still smell faintly of roses? Then, she heard music, very soft. A piano. The melody drifted from upstairs. Slow, melancholy, beautiful enough to make her chest ache. Audrey froze. Someone was here. The music stopped. Instantly. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then a voice spoke behind her. "You shouldn't be wandering around in storms." Audrey gasped. She turned. An old man stood beside the fireplace. She could swear he hadn't been there a second ago. He looked about 80, tall but thin, silver hair combed neatly back, a wool sweater beneath an old brown coat. In one hand, he held a lantern. In the other, a small bouquet of white roses. Audrey placed a hand over her racing heart. "You scared me." The old man smiled apologetically. "I've been told that before." There was kindness in his eyes, but sadness too. A sadness so old it seemed woven into him. "My name is Walter Hayes." Audrey hesitated. "Audrey Collins." Walter nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting that answer. "I know." Audrey frowned. "You know me." Walter looked toward the staircase, toward the glowing window upstairs. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you." A chill ran down Audrey's spine. "What do you mean?" Walter sighed. The kind of sigh people make when carrying memories too heavy to share. "Come warm yourself first." The kitchen surprised her. Unlike the rest of the hotel, it was alive. A fire crackled in an iron stove. A kettle steamed gently. The smell of chicken soup filled the room. Walter ladled soup into a bowl and placed it before her. Audrey stared. "You live here. For 53 years. Alone." Walter smiled faintly. "Not always." Something about the way he said it made Audrey not ask another question. She ate slowly. The soup was warm, homemade, comforting. And suddenly, Audrey realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her. A lump formed in her throat. Walter pretended not to notice. Old people are kind that way. After a while, Audrey looked around. Every shelf was spotless. Fresh flowers stood in a vase near the window. A record player sat in the corner. And on the mantel, a photograph, a young woman, beautiful, dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her smile soft and sad, standing in front of the hotel exactly as it had looked a century ago. Audrey pointed. "Who is she?" Walter's face changed instantly. The warmth in his eyes faded. He walked over slowly and picked up the frame. For a long moment, he simply stared at the woman. Then he whispered, "She was the bravest person I ever knew." Audrey waited. Walter didn't continue. Instead, he returned the photograph carefully, almost reverently. Her name was Isabella Whitmore. The name hung in the air. Strange, familiar, as if Audrey had heard it before. "She owned this hotel?" Audrey asked. Walter nodded. "A very long time ago." "What happened to her?" Walter was silent. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. The old man stared into the fire, then said quietly, "Some stories don't die." Audrey shivered. Walter looked up at her, and for the first time that night, she saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. He reached beneath his sweater, pulled out a silver chain. Hanging from it was an old key, small, worn smooth with age, its head engraved with a single number. 13. Audrey couldn't take her eyes off it. Walter noticed. His hand tightened around the key. Immediately, protectively. "What's that for?" Audrey asked. Walter didn't answer. Instead, he looked upstairs, toward the third floor, toward the only room with light. The fire crackled softly. Rain beat against the windows, and Walter whispered, "For 100 years." His voice trembled. "That room has been waiting for someone." He turned back to Audrey, his eyes glistening. "And tonight," he swallowed hard, "I think it finally found her." Audrey's heart skipped. She looked toward the staircase, toward the golden light glowing patiently in the darkness. And somehow, without understanding why, she knew whatever was hidden behind room 13 was about to change her life forever. Audrey Collins couldn't stop thinking about room 13. All evening, she tried to ignore it. She helped Walter water the roses. She dusted old picture frames in the hallway. She even sat by the fireplace pretending to read. But the truth was, her mind never left the third floor, and neither did her heart. That night, rain fell softly outside the hotel. Audrey lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Then, suddenly, she smelled roses. Fresh roses. Sweet. Delicate. Impossible. She sat up. The scent drifted through the hallway. A moment later, she heard music. A piano. The same sad melody she'd heard on her first night. Soft. Lonely. As if someone was remembering a life they wished they'd lived differently. Audrey slipped out of bed. The hallway was empty. Yet the music continued, and the scent of roses grew stronger, leading her upstairs, to the third floor, at the end of the corridor. Room 13 stood waiting. The golden light beneath the door flickered gently. Audrey remembered Walter's warning. Some doors stay closed for a reason, but this door was already open, just enough as if someone had left it that way, waiting. For her, Audrey pushed it gently. The room opened without resistance, and suddenly, the entire world seemed to disappear. The room was frozen in time. Moonlight spilled across polished wooden floors. Books lined the shelves. An unfinished embroidery rested beside an armchair. Fresh roses filled a crystal vase. Audrey stopped. Fresh roses. Her breath caught. No one had entered this room for over a century. Walter had told her that, and yet, the flowers looked as if they'd been placed there yesterday. A strange sadness filled her chest. Not fear, grief. A grief so old it didn't belong to her. Then she saw it. A red leather diary resting on a small desk. Beside it lay a dried black rose, its petals fragile with age. The cover bore a single name, Isabella Whitmore. Audrey slowly opened it. The first pages surprised her. There were sketches of the garden, recipes, poems, descriptions of parties in the ballroom. A young woman dreaming of love, dreaming of freedom, dreaming of a father who loved her. Audrey smiled sadly. She understood that feeling. Then the handwriting changed. The elegant script became rushed, uneven, afraid. Father says loyalty is more important than truth. But what if loyalty to evil is its own kind of sin? Audrey frowned. She kept reading. Sometimes I stand alone in the ballroom and pretend Mother is still alive. I pretend Father still loves me. I pretend this house isn't breaking my heart. Audrey stopped. A lump formed in her throat. Those words felt painfully familiar, because Audrey had spent years pretending too. Pretending her father would someday choose her. Pretending she wasn't lonely. Pretending she wasn't broken. Tears filled her eyes. She turned the page, and everything changed. Tonight I discovered who my father truly is. The date at the top read, October 17th, 1923. The ink was smeared, as if Isabella had cried while writing. Black Hollow was never built on hope. It was built on greed. Audrey's heart began to race. More than 100 years ago, families came to Black Hollow chasing a better life. They built homes, opened stores, raised children. Then gold was discovered beneath the mountains, and everything changed. A man named William Collins arrived. Handsome, charming, ambitious. He promised prosperity. He built the Black Rose Hotel. He became the wealthiest man in town. People worshipped him. They called him the founder of Black Hollow. But according to Isabella, he was something else entirely. William Collins forged deeds, stole land, threatened families, and when people refused to leave, they vanished. Their homes burned, their names erased, their bodies buried deep inside abandoned mines. Audrey stared at the pages, her hands trembling. Then she read the line that shattered her. The cruelest thing my father ever stole wasn't land, it was his own soul. Tears blurred Audrey's vision. She kept reading. I begged Father to stop. He looked at me as if I were a stranger. Then, a Collins protects the family, he said. Isabella replied, even if the family is wrong. And William answered. Especially then, Audrey covered her mouth. Her chest ached, because suddenly, she wasn't reading Isabella's story anymore. She was reading her own. A father who chose pride. A daughter begging to be loved. a silence stretching across generations. The next line broke her heart. That was the night I realized my father loved the Collins name more than he loved me. Audrey began to cry. Really cry. Not quietly. Not politely. The way people cry when old wounds are suddenly opened. She sat on the floor beside the bed, holding the diary tightly, and whispered, "Me too." The room was silent, except for her sobs. "All my life," she whispered, "I thought my father hated me." A tear slid down her cheek. And now, she looked at Isabella's words. Maybe he hated himself. Maybe grief destroyed her father. The same way greed destroyed William Collins. The thought hurt, because pain passed from one generation to another, unless someone was brave enough to stop it. A floorboard creaked behind her. Audrey looked up. Walter stood in the doorway. His eyes were red. He'd been crying too, for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. Then Walter walked inside, sat beside her, and gently touched the diary. "I hated William Collins," he said quietly. "For years." He swallowed hard. "I thought Isabella died because of him." His voice trembled. But now, he looked at Audrey. "I think she died because nobody stood beside her." Audrey lowered her eyes. Walter's voice softened. "Don't let history do that to you." Fresh tears rolled down Audrey's face. Walter reached beneath his sweater. Slowly, he removed the silver key, the one engraved with the number 13. He placed it in Audrey's trembling hand. The metal was cold, heavy, as if carrying the weight of a century. Audrey looked at him. "What is this?" Walter stared at the portrait hanging above the fireplace, at Isabella, and whispered, "It's time." Audrey frowned. "Time for what?" Walter looked back at her, his eyes shining with tears, and said the words that would change Audrey's life forever. To finish what Isabella died trying to begin. Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind carried the scent of roses, and for the first time in her life, Audrey Collins understood. She hadn't come to Black Hollow by accident. The hotel hadn't saved her. It had chosen her. And now, there was no turning back. Audrey Collins sat alone in room 13 long after Walter had gone downstairs. The diary lay open in her lap. William Collins, founder of Black Hollow, owner of the Black Rose Hotel, father of Isabella Whitmore, and her own ancestor. The words still didn't feel real. All her life, Audrey had believed her family was ordinary. Broken, perhaps, but ordinary. Now she knew the truth. The Collins family hadn't just inherited wealth, they had inherited silence. And silence, Audrey was beginning to understand, could wound people just as deeply as cruelty. She looked around Isabella's room. The neatly arranged books, the dried flowers, the unfinished embroidery beside the fireplace. Everything felt heartbreakingly human. Not the room of a ghost. The room of a daughter who spent her life trying to make her father see what was right, and failed. Audrey wiped away her tears, because for the first time, she wasn't angry at Isabella. She wasn't even angry at William Collins. She was angry at the way pain kept repeating itself. Generation after generation, William chose power over his daughter. Her own father chose grief over love. And Audrey had spent her whole life choosing fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of disappointment. Fear of loving people who might never love her back. She lowered her eyes. Maybe loneliness wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. Maybe. Becoming incapable of love was A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Walter stood at the doorway. In his hands was a tray with tea and 2 slices of apple pie. Audrey smiled weakly. "You always know when people are falling apart." Walter chuckled. "No." He placed the tray down. "But I know what loneliness looks like." He sat beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence felt warm. "Safe?" Finally, Audrey asked. "Why have you stayed here for 53 years? Walter looked toward the window. Moonlight bathed the rose garden below. His eyes softened. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "my mother used to tell me stories about Isabella." Audrey looked up. Walter smiled. "My mother was 9 years old when Isabella saved her." "Saved her?" Audrey asked softly. Walter nodded. "When the violence began, people stopped trusting each other. Families disappeared overnight. My grandmother was terrified. She wanted to run, but Isabella hid them." His voice trembled. "For weeks, right here in this hotel," Audrey slowly looked around the room, trying to imagine it. A frightened little girl, a brave young woman, a town falling apart. Walter smiled sadly. "My mother used to say Isabella was the kindest person she'd ever known." He paused. "She also said Isabella cried every night." Audrey lowered her eyes. "That didn't surprise her." Walter continued. "Before Isabella died," his voice softened, "she gave my mother the diary. And she said," Walter swallowed, "someday someone brave enough will come." Audrey stared at him. "My mother kept that diary hidden her whole life. When she died," Walter smiled faintly, "she gave it to me." He looked around the room. "And she made me promise." "What promise?" Audrey asked. Walter's eyes glistened. "That I would protect Isabella's story. For as long as I lived." Audrey felt something tighten inside her chest. "For 53 years, Walter whispered. I waited. People came. Treasure hunters, journalists, historians." He shook his head. "But the hotel never opened room 13 for them." Audrey frowned. "The hotel," Walter laughed softly. "I know how crazy that sounds." Then his smile faded. "But I've lived here long enough to know." He looked straight at her. "This place chooses people." A chill ran down Audrey's spine. Walter pointed toward Isabella's diary. "You know why the room opened for you?" Audrey shook her head. "Because Isabella wasn't waiting for revenge." He smiled gently. "She was waiting for someone who understood her." The words hit Audrey harder than she expected. Because she did understand. The loneliness, the disappointment, the desperate hope that one day someone would choose you. Tears filled her eyes. "I spent my whole life waiting for my father to love me." Walter nodded. "I know. And now I find out," her voice broke, "that the women in my family have been waiting for the same thing for over 100 years. Walter didn't deny it. Because some truths are too painful to soften. After a while he said, "Your father isn't William Collins." Audrey looked at him. "And neither are you." Simple words, but they shattered something inside her. All her life, Audrey had been defined by what she lacked. A loving father, a real home, a family that wanted her, and now she was terrified of being defined by something else. The sins of her ancestors. Walter gently placed his hand over hers. "You inherited their name." He nodded toward the diary. "But you also inherited Isabella's courage." Audrey stared at him. "You really believe that?" Walter smiled. "My mother used to tell me something." He looked toward Isabella's portrait hanging above the fireplace. "Some people inherit money. Others inherit pain. He turned back to Audrey. But a few rare souls, his eyes shining with tears, inherit the courage to change everything. The room fell silent. Audrey looked again at Isabella's portrait, at the sadness in her eyes, at the strength hidden beneath it, and for the first time in her life, Audrey Collins stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead, she asked, "What can I do now?" It was a small change, just a few words. But sometimes, a new life begins with a new question. Audrey stood and walked to the window. Below her, Black Hollow slept beneath the moonlight. Abandoned houses, empty streets, forgotten names, a whole town carrying wounds older than she could imagine. She placed her hand against the cold glass and whispered, "I can't change what William Collins did." She took a shaky breath. "But I can make sure people remember the truth." The wind stirred the roses below. Somewhere in the hotel, a piano began to play. Not sad this time, not lonely, hopeful, as if Isabella herself had been waiting 100 years to hear someone finally say those words. The next morning, Audrey Collins woke before sunrise. For a few moments, she forgot where she was. Then she saw Isabella's diary on the nightstand, and everything came rushing back. William Collins, the stolen land, the families who disappeared, the daughters who spent generations waiting to be loved. Audrey sat up slowly. She looked out the window. The town of Black Hollow lay beneath a blanket of morning mist. Silent, forgotten, waiting. For the first time since arriving, Audrey didn't see a ghost town. She saw unfinished stories, and suddenly, she wanted to know every single one of them. Walter was already in the garden, trimming the roses, as if he had done the exact same thing every morning for the last 50 years. Audrey walked toward him. "I want to help." Walter looked up. The morning sun lit the wrinkles on his face. For a moment, he looked surprised. Then he smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." That day, Walter took Audrey to places no one had visited in decades. The old church, its stained glass windows shattered. Dust covered the pews. Yet names were still carved into the wood. Maria Alvarez, Thomas O'Brien, Elena Russo. People who once laughed, prayed, dreamed. People history had forgotten, but not completely. Then Walter led her to the cemetery, or at least, what was left of it. Most gravestones had crumbled. Some names had been scratched away. Others had no names at all, just dates and silence. Walter knelt beside one grave, a tiny one, no larger than a suitcase. "My mother used to bring flowers here," he whispered. Audrey looked down. The stone simply read, "Grace, 1914 to 1923. Nothing else. "No last name?" Audrey asked. Walter shook his head. "Nobody knows." He brushed leaves from the stone. As she was one of the children who disappeared, Audrey felt her throat tighten. A child, only 9 years old. Gone, and no one remembered her. Walter stood slowly. His whole town is filled with Graces. He looked around. People whose stories were stolen. Then he looked at Audrey. And stories died twice. She frowned. The first time, Walter pointed at the graves. "When people die," his voice trembled. The second, he touched Isabella's diary tucked beneath Audrey's arm. "When nobody remembers them." That night, Audrey couldn't stop thinking about those words. She sat in the library beside the fireplace, reading Isabella's diary again. This time, she wasn't searching for secrets. She was searching for people, and she found them. There was Maria, a widow from Mexico who baked bread every Sunday. There was Samuel, a school teacher who taught children to read. There was little Grace, the girl who loved fireflies, the girl who wanted to become a singer. Audrey cried reading their stories, not because they died, but because they had once lived so beautifully, and nobody remembered. Until now, days turned into weeks. For the first time in years, Audrey stopped thinking about herself. She organized Isabella's papers, cleaned old photographs, labeled names, mapped family trees. Every morning she explored another corner of Black Hollow. Every evening she returned to the hotel carrying another forgotten story. Walter watched quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying when Audrey wasn't looking. One afternoon, Audrey discovered an old storage room beneath the hotel. Inside were dozens of dusty boxes, letters, birth certificates, photographs, newspapers, enough to rewrite the entire history of Black Hollow. Audrey sat on the floor for hours, carefully opening envelopes. One photograph caught her attention. A group of children standing in front of the church, smiling, laughing. Little Grace was there, and standing beside her was Walter's mother, 9 years old, holding Isabella's hand. Audrey stared at the picture. Suddenly, the past didn't feel distant anymore. It felt alive. That evening, Audrey placed the photo in front of Walter. The old man froze. His hands began to shake. He picked up the picture gently, as though afraid it might disappear. "My mother," he whispered. His eyes filled with tears. "I haven't seen this in 60 years. Audrey sat beside him. Neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. Walter wiped his eyes, then laughed. A quiet laugh. "You know something." Audrey smiled. "What?" "I spent half my life protecting this hotel." He looked at her. "But you're the first person who ever tried to save the town." The words hit Audrey harder than she expected, because for most of her life, she'd been trying to save herself, and failing. But somehow, helping others made her feel whole. That night, Audrey stood alone on the balcony of the 3rd floor. The wind moved gently through the roses below. Black Hollow stretched endlessly before her. Broken, forgotten, but no longer hopeless. For the first time in her life, Audrey Collins felt something she almost didn't recognize. Purpose. Not because of her family name, not because she wanted revenge, but because somewhere between the ghosts of Black Hollow and the kindness of an old man, she had found something she never expected, a reason to stay. She looked toward room 13, toward Isabella's portrait, and smiled through her tears. "I think I understand now." The wind stirred softly. The roses swayed, and in the silence, Audrey could almost hear Isabella whisper, "You're not here to carry our pain. You're here to end it." For the first time in 26 years, Audrey Collins didn't feel like a girl who had been abandoned. She felt like a woman who had finally found her place in the world. Spring arrived quietly in Black Hollow. The snow melted from the rooftops. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the sidewalks. And for the first time in decades, people began visiting the town again. At first, it was only a few curious travelers. A photographer from Chicago, a history teacher from Madison, a woman searching for information about her great-grandmother. Audrey welcomed them all. She showed them Isabella's diary, the old photographs, the names she'd carefully written onto new wooden plaques. Every story she uncovered felt like returning something precious to the world. And slowly, the world started giving something back. One afternoon, an elderly woman arrived carrying a faded shoebox. Her hands trembled as she held it. "My name is Rosa Alvarez," she said softly. "My grandmother was Maria Alvarez." Audrey froze. She remembered the name. Maria, the widow from Isabella's diary. The woman who baked bread every Sunday. Audrey invited Rosa inside. Together, they opened the box. There were photographs, recipes written in Spanish, a tiny silver cross, and dozens of letters. Letters Maria had written, but never sent. Rosa began to cry. "I thought my family was forgotten." Audrey reached across the table and took her hand. "No." Her voice was gentle. They were waiting to be remembered. Rosa wept harder. And, unexpectedly, so did Audrey, because she suddenly realized this wasn't history anymore. This was healing. More people came. The O'Brien family, the Russo family, the grandchildren of miners, the descendants of immigrants, each carrying a fragment of the past, each carrying grief and hope. The grand ballroom of the Black Rose Hotel slowly transformed. Dusty furniture disappeared. Long tables appeared. Walls once filled with silence were covered in photographs. Children ran through hallways that had been empty for a century. Laughter echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Walter watched it all with tears in his eyes. One evening he stood beside Audrey in the ballroom. The room buzzed with life. He smiled. "I haven't heard laughter here since I was a boy." Audrey looked around. Neither had she. At least, not laughter that felt like home. For years, Audrey had believed she was unwanted. The girl her father couldn't love. The burden her stepmother tolerated. The woman nobody chose. But now, people looked for her. They hugged her, trusted her. Not because of the Collins name, but because of her kindness. Because she listened, really listened. And for someone who had spent her whole life feeling invisible, that changed everything. One morning, Audrey found Walter planting new roses. There were dozens of them. Red, white, yellow. The old man worked slowly, his hands shaking. Audrey hurried over. "You should let me do that." Walter chuckled. "I've waited 53 years to see this garden alive again." He pressed the soil gently around a rose bush, then stopped, catching his breath. Audrey frowned. "You okay?" Walter smiled. "Just But something in his eyes worried her. As summer approached, Walter grew weaker. He slept more, walked slower. Sometimes Audrey caught him staring at Isabella's portrait with tears in his eyes. Not sadness, peace, as though he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and was finally ready to put it down. One evening, Audrey found him sitting alone on the porch, watching the sunset. She sat beside him. For a while, they said nothing. Then Walter asked, "Do you still hate your father?" The question surprised her. Audrey looked toward the mountains and thought carefully. "I don't know." Walter nodded. "That's honest." She smiled faintly. "I used to think my whole life would have been different if he'd loved me." Walter waited. "But now..." She looked back at the hotel. "I'm starting to think maybe I spent too much time waiting." Walter smiled. A proud smile. "That's growth." Audrey laughed softly. "No." She shook her head. "This." She looked at the hotel glowing beneath the evening sky. "This is love." Walter's eyes filled with tears, because that was exactly what Isabella had wanted. Not revenge, not justice alone, but love surviving where hatred once lived. Later that night, Audrey climbed to room 13. She stood before Isabella's portrait, the same portrait that had once made her cry. But tonight was different. She smiled. You know, she whispered, I used to think we were the same. She touched the frame gently. But we aren't. A tear slid down her cheek. You spent your life trying to make your father change. She laughed softly. I think I'm finally learning to change myself. The room was silent. Warm. Peaceful. And for the first time, Audrey wasn't afraid of the Collins name. She wasn't ashamed of it either, because she finally understood. The greatest way to defeat the past is not to erase it. It's to build something better in its place. Downstairs, the ballroom lights glowed. People laughed. Music played. The scent of roses drifted through the halls. Audrey looked out the window. At the town, at the hotel, at the life she'd never imagined she could have. And suddenly, she thought of her father, not with anger, not even with sadness, just compassion, because grief had trapped him, the same way guilt trapped William Collins. But she was finally free, and maybe that was Isabella's greatest gift, not the diary, not the secrets, but the courage to stop inheriting pain and start creating hope for herself, for Black Hollow, and for everyone who thought they were too broken to belong. Because Audrey Collins knew something now that she'd spent 26 years trying to learn. Sometimes, the place that saves you is the place you decide to save in return. Autumn arrived in Black Hollow with golden leaves and cool mornings. The town no longer felt abandoned. Children rode bicycles down streets that had once been silent. Flowers bloomed beneath windows that had been boarded shut for decades. And every evening, lights glowed warmly from the Black Rose Hotel. People came from everywhere, some searching for family, some searching for answers, and some, without realizing it, searching for themselves. Audrey welcomed them all. She listened to their stories. She cried with them, laughed with them, and slowly, the hotel became something entirely new. Not a monument to tragedy, but a home for healing. People started calling it the House of Lost Voices, and Audrey loved that, because for most of her life, she had been one of those lost voices. One chilly October morning, Walter asked Audrey to help him into the garden. He had grown weaker over the summer. His hands shook more. His steps were slower. But his eyes had never looked more peaceful. They sat together beneath the old oak tree overlooking the valley. The roses were still blooming. Walter smiled. Funny, isn't it? Audrey looked at him. I spent half my life waiting for this town to heal. He glanced toward the hotel, and I almost missed it. Audrey gently squeezed his hand. You didn't? Walter smiled. No, his eyes shimmered. I really didn't. For a moment they sat in silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who love each other. Then Walter reached into his coat pocket and handed Audrey an old envelope. Its edges were worn, the paper yellow with age. My mother asked me to give you this someday. Audrey frowned. Me? Walter nodded. I just didn't know who you were yet. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant, delicate. It was Isabella's, to the woman who comes after me. If you are reading this, then I was right. Someone kind enough to carry this burden finally arrived. Audrey felt tears sting her eyes. She kept reading. Please don't spend your life hating William Collins. I did, and hatred nearly destroyed me. A tear rolled down Audrey's cheek. The greatest revenge isn't exposing darkness. It's creating light where darkness once lived. She paused, trying to steady her breathing. I hope you laugh often. I hope you love deeply, and I hope this hotel becomes the home I always dreamed it could be. The final line was almost too faded to read. Most of all, I hope someone loves you the way you deserve to be loved all along. Audrey broke down crying, not because Isabella was gone, but because somehow, a woman who died a century ago understood her better than anyone ever had. Walter wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and, for the first time since she was a child, Audrey let herself cry without shame that winter. Walter Hayes passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 82 years old. The whole town came to his funeral. People he had helped, people he had guided, people whose names he remembered when no one else did. Audrey stood beside his grave, clutching a single white rose. Snow fell softly around her. She couldn't stop crying, because Walter had been the grandfather she'd never had, the family she thought she'd lost forever. Before the service ended, Audrey placed the rose on his coffin and whispered, "You kept your promise." Her voice shook. "I'll keep mine." Months passed. Spring returned, and Black Hollow bloomed again. The hotel was alive. The ballroom hosted concerts. The library held old photographs and family histories. The gardens overflowed with roses. People no longer came searching for ghosts. They came searching for hope, and somehow, they always found it. Every evening, Audrey climbed to room 13. She carried a fresh red rose and placed it beside Isabella's portrait. A ritual, a thank you, a promise. One evening, a little girl visiting the hotel followed her upstairs. She couldn't have been older than 8. She watched Audrey place the flower down, then asked softly, "Why do you do that every day?" Audrey smiled. She looked at Isabella's portrait, at the sadness in her eyes, at the courage hidden beneath it, and then she looked at the little girl. "Because some people save the world." Her voice caught. "And nobody remembers their names." She gently touched the frame. "I refuse to let her be one of them." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood. Maybe she did. That night, Audrey stood by the window. The moon hung over Black Hollow. The hotel glowed warmly behind her, and, for the first time in a very long time, she thought about her father. Not with anger, not with grief, just gratitude. Because if he hadn't sent her away, she never would have come here, never would have met Walter, never would have known Isabella, never would have discovered that family isn't always blood. Sometimes, family is the people who help you become who you were always meant to be. Audrey smiled through tears. 26 years ago, she believed nobody wanted her, but standing there, surrounded by laughter, memories, and love, she finally understood something beautiful. The Black Rose Hotel hadn't saved her. Walter hadn't saved her. Not even Isabella. They simply showed her the truth, that she had been worthy of love all along, and sometimes, the greatest miracle in life is finding the place that reminds you of that, the place that loves you back. Years passed, and somehow, Black Hollow became alive again. The abandoned bakery reopened. Children's laughter echoed through streets that had once known only silence. The church bells rang every Sunday, and every spring, the gardens of the Black Rose Hotel bloomed brighter than the year before. People no longer came looking for ghosts. They came looking for hope, and somehow, they always found it, because Audrey Collins made sure they did. Every evening, just before sunset, Audrey climbed the stairs to room 13, always carrying a single red rose, always alone. She would place the flower beside Isabella's portrait, open the windows, straighten the old lace curtains, and sit quietly for a while, Not because she believed Isabella was still there, but because love has a strange way of staying in places long after people are gone, and some promises deserve to be kept forever. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address. No name. Only her own written carefully across the front. Audrey Collins. Her hands trembled, because somehow she already knew. She sat alone in the library. The fire crackled softly beside her, and slowly she opened the envelope. Inside was an old photograph. A little girl, no older than 6, sitting on her father's shoulders, laughing. Audrey stared at it. She had forgotten this picture existed. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were just a few words. I spent my whole life mourning your mother, and almost lost my daughter, too. A tear rolled down Audrey's cheek. She kept reading. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. The next line was smudged, as if written through tears. But if there is one thing I want you to know, Audrey held her breath. You were never the reason I suffered. She closed her eyes. For 26 years, those were the words she'd dreamed of hearing. And now, they hurt less than she imagined. Not because they didn't matter, but because she no longer needed them to heal. She cried, quietly, gently, not for the little girl who'd been abandoned, but for the lonely man who never learned how to love her. Then Audrey did something unexpected. She smiled and whispered, I forgive you, not because he asked, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. That evening, she carried the photograph upstairs to room 13. She placed it beside Isabella's portrait, beside Walter's old silver key. 3 lives, 3 broken hearts, 3 people connected by grief and by hope. Audrey looked at them for a long moment, then laughed softly. You know, she whispered, I spent my whole life waiting to be loved. The room was silent. Warm? Safe. She smiled through tears. And I was loved. By Walter. By this town. By strangers who became family. And finally, by herself. Outside, the wind moved gently through the rose garden. The golden light of room 13 flickered softly. Audrey stood, walked toward the door, then stopped. For some reason, she turned back and looked at Isabella's portrait one last time. The sadness she'd always seen in Isabella's eyes was gone, or maybe it was Audrey who had changed. She smiled. Good night, Isabella. A gentle breeze swept through the room. The scent of roses filled the air. And then, for the first time in over 100 years, the light in room 13 went out. Audrey didn't cry. She didn't feel afraid, because she understood. Some spirits don't stay because they're trapped. They stay because they're waiting. Waiting to be remembered. Waiting to be forgiven. Waiting to know. Their suffering meant something, and Isabella had waited long enough. Audrey closed the door softly behind her and walked downstairs, toward laughter, toward music, toward the life she'd built. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be loved. Audrey Collins learned something different. Love isn't something you wait for. Sometimes it's something you become, and maybe that's what home really is. Not a place where you've never been hurt. Not a place where everyone stays, but a place that teaches you this. The people who failed to love you were never proof that you were hard to love.